Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and tonight we're going to read and then discuss The Hole in the Horn of Plenty by Damon Runyon. 1. Van Clief was an institution. All cities have institutions, just as people have customs and habits. If a man or an object does one thing long enough, he or it becomes an institution. For instance, a statue of George Washington stands in a fixed spot for quite a spell. It is an institution, and is pointed out to strangers. Similarly, for 20 years, Van Clief was rarely seen away from a particular chair at a particular table in the famous old Café des Arts for more than a few moments during the night hours that the place was open. He brought a profound intellect to bear upon the subject of dining to such effect that he builded himself an Epicurean reputation which took him to the institutional class. To the patrons and attachés of the café, he became not a carefully groomed old gentleman peacefully eating food, but an institution. Van Clief made dining an art. He made it a thing of beauty. He breathed elegance and grace into the business of handling a knife and fork. He went about it as a great painter would set himself to the production of a masterpiece. Viands upon which the plate of an ordinary diner would simply be something to eat became delicate and rare works when placed before Van Clief. The items of food which he selected from the menu immediately took on a strange dignity. In short, Van Clief made dining not a duty, not a necessity, but a function. The waiters were indeed proud to whisper a few words of his history to the guest from Sacramento, as they figured 9 and 7 into 18. The chef knew him by sight. On one memorable occasion, Van Clief had sent for Jacques in person to compliment him upon a gastronomical triumph. They had even shaken hands, silently and understandingly. Thereafter the name of Jacques was graven high upon the scroll of culinary achievement. Van Clief had permanent means, wherefore he parlayed a 7-course meal into a 20-year banquet. A Colorado gold mine with $4 million worth of ore blocked out in it was set to be the base of his assets. So, for 20 years, Van Clief dined each evening at the Café des Arts. He had apartments hard by, and promptly at 8 o'clock he would stroll into the café. Quiet and unostentatious as was his entry, it was always an event. There would be a genteel bustling about by the head waiter and his minions, a subdued hissing volley of good evenings, and a noticeably sudden tightening of decorum in the atmosphere. The orchestra would slip into a gentle, dreamy lullaby that was his favorite. Henri Van Clief's particular waiter would encase him in his particular chair at his particular table, making sure the light fell at the proper angle, and would hand him his particular newspaper, which was the ultra-conservative Evening Republican. And then, having settled himself comfortably, Van Clief would proceed in his capacity of institution to the momentous matter of selecting his dinner, while Henri took attentive note and the other waiters hovered admiringly in the background. Sitting there, Van Clief became infallibility and the premise of dining. He became the supreme judge of the court of last resort on all questions pertaining to the food. Did a querulous guest make plaint that the consommé was too cold, that the wine was not at a proper temperature, that a dish was thus, and so the head waiter later would glide softly over to Van Clief and make respectful inquiry. Did that final word adjudicate the matter in favor of the consommé, the wine, or the dish, then the petulant guest became, in the eyes of the Café des Arts, a fool or a knave, and perhaps both. The proprietors of the café were convinced that Lucullus was simply a previous incarnation of Van Clief, with none of Van Clief's judgment as to a place to dine. They honored Van Clief as an institution. They pointed him out to deserving strangers. They discussed with him their troubles concerning the excise laws. And from 8 o'clock in the evening till past midnight, Van Clief dined, carefully, abstemiously, but elegantly, aye, graciously. During those hours, dining at the Café des Arts was indeed one of the superior enjoyments. Van Clief was a gourmet, but never a gourmand. In 20 years, naturally, he took on contour, gracefully, elegantly, as he dined. Wisdom and ineffable content shone from his countenance. He rode the years easily, pleasantly, growing old with the wine and with the songs that the singers sang, conscious of his position as an institution, perhaps, but never arrogant or unduly proud. He observed, without comment, whole generations of young gentlemen roll so high that they became lost in space, but he proceeded quietly through the years, adding each day something to his reputation, respected and protected as an institution. Protected because no man was permitted to go into the Café des Arts and filch a single ray of reflected Epicurean glory by asking a waiter to bring him what Van Clief ordered. This was attempted once. Only once. The sensation lingered for weeks. You see, Van Clief had never ordered anything in his life. He selected. He suggested. This rash request was in sacrilegious line with the proposition made to the proprietors that they should name certain dishes a la Van Clief. Van Clief lived in an atmosphere of attention. The waiters anticipated his every desire. They appreciated the fact that his reputation was founded upon broad knowledge, and he commanded their respect. Greatness can receive no finer tribute. 2. Even the greatest man cannot live forever. It was generally predicted that Van Clief, when his time came, would pass away some night as he sat at his favorite table, that his going would be gracious, pleasant, as his life had been. But fate decreed otherwise. Early one morning, after he had gone to bed, fire broke out in the Café des Arts, and gutted it from cigar case to kitchen. Van Clief knew nothing, heard nothing of the upsetting of this old order of things. His valet failed to mention the matter when he brought him his chocolate and toast, the only sustenance Van Clief allowed himself during the day, prior to dining. Shortly before 8 o'clock, he strolled over toward the Café des Arts, a carefully drawn study of prosperity done in evening attire, a pleasant old gentleman who nodded frequently to passers-by, who cheerily hailed a diminutive newsboy, and spoke without animus to a member of the traffic squad. An elegant old gentleman, at peace with himself and the world. An institution, no less. He had traversed this same route every evening for 20 years. When he reached the Café des Arts, he found the two proprietors poking aimlessly about the debris, trying to uncover the safe. Van Clief's world lay a smoldering, smelly heap over which the arc lights threw an eerie glare. The proprietors explained to Van Clief while he stood gaping at the blackened rafters. "But where am I going to dine?" he finally inquired, helplessly, after they had talked and gesticulated in dismal fashion for half an hour. "It's my dinner time." "Dine, man!" one of the owners shrieked. "Dine? Why, dine where you blame please!" Then the other, sensing Van Clief's complete bewilderment, said kindly, "There's a nice place over on 38th Street. I'll call a taxicab and send you there. This old place is off the beaten trail, you know, and all the other good restaurants are quite a distance from here." They bundled Van Clief into a taxi and gave the driver proper directions. Van Clief had undergone a complete transformation. His self-possession, his savoir-faire had suddenly abandoned him at this upsetting of his routine. He was a bewildered old gentleman in a taxicab, wondering where he should dine. Through the windows of the taxicab he saw the gaily lighted streets and the ebb and flow of the enormous tide of humanity. For 20 years he had confined himself in the evening very closely to the Café des Arts, which, as the electric waves washed their brilliancy in a new direction, came to be somewhat removed from the real center of turbulence, and all this was new to Van Clief. His confusion was greater when the taxi pulled up in front of a wonderfully lighted restaurant. The arrangement of the place was different from his old dear Café des Arts. The crowds were greater, and there were no familiar faces. No obsequious raiders hummed attention as he entered the doors. The Czech boys snatched his coat and hat without a smile or word of greeting, and he was hurried to a table which stood in a draught by a head waiter who never gave him a second glance. Van Clief was brought to an instant realization of the fact that he was an institution without a job. If you took the statue of Washington and set it down in a bullring in Spain, it would probably feel the same way. The waiters seemed insolent, not in words, of course, but it appeared to Van Clief that they attended him with scant respect, and certainly without veneration. Habit, the old copybooks tell us, is a cable. We weave a thread of it every day, and at last we cannot break it. Van Clief had woven to such effect that haste in dining was no part of his method, and he knew instinctively that the waiter was in a hurry. Van Clief felt the ease which had distinguished him in the selection of his viands at the Café des Arts oozing from his fingertips. He became indignantly conscious that his personal suggestions were merely following the line of the waiter's forefinger as it moved hastily down the card. He realized that his art was being debased by a rapid-fire linguist who was coldly calculating his probable value as a tipster. His soul revolted, but he must dine. "May I have the evening paper?" he asked, when he had finished with the card. "What paper?" inquired the waiter casually. "Call, Inquirer, Chronicle?" Van Clief was vaguely surprised. He had long ago forgotten the existence of any newspaper but the Evening Republican. "The Republican," he said. But the waiter shook his head. "I don't have it around here. I can send out, sir." "I'll try the Call," said Van Clief. The waiter placed before him an inflamed newspaper which tried his eyes and his nerves with large headlines and wholly unconservative statements. He gazed at his surroundings. Obviously, it was a first-class place. The guests were in correct attire, but there was great confusion, a great clatter of dishes and voices. These people were eating, not dining. Van Clief's artistic sensibilities were sorely wounded. Eventually, the waiter brought him a large number of dishes upon which food seemed to be heaped in masses. The man unloaded his burden before Van Clief noisily. There were great silver tureens and dishes covered with pewter-like bowls. Van Clief was horrified. "My heavens!" he groaned. "I cannot dine in this fashion, my man." "It's what you ordered," replied the waiter stonily. "But this isn't the way to do it," expostulated Van Clief, every artistic nerve in revolt. "You ordered it," persisted the waiter. Rather than further abase himself by argument, Van Clief plucked gingerly at one of the dishes and tasted the food contained therein. Then he fled incontinently, expostulating, "Oh, my heavens, I simply could not dine upon such a mess." He got a taxicab and instructed the driver to take him to the old Café des Arts. The place was tightly boarded up, but he discovered an opening at one of the windows, and there he entered. He found an old chair somewhat charred, and located the site of his old table. There, a special officer who was guarding the place came upon him some hours later, sitting among the ruins. The officer escorted him to his apartments and the care of his valet. 3. Each subsequent night was like the first for Van Clief, a terrible nightmare. By calling taxicabs, he could reach the different restaurants recommended to him, but he found no place where he could dine after his custom. He found no place where he was appreciated or recognized as an institution. Rather welcoming the fire as an opportunity for making a long-planned move, the proprietors of the old Café des Arts were fitting up a new place uptown. To Van Clief's horror, a drugstore opened in the former location. To him, this was a sacrilege. He thought of the expedient of buying the building and preserving it as a delicate memory, but he never carried out the idea because he was busied in trying to get himself settled somewhere else. Night after night he sallied forth, immaculate, impeccable, sternly resolved that he would impress himself in his true capacity, only to slink back to his apartments, disappointed and hurt at the complete loneliness of the big town, at the utter obscurity into which he had suddenly fallen. In the cloister of the Café des Arts, he had been a carefully nurtured institution, an Epicurean votary at his devoir. With the crash of the rafters in the old place, he became simply a man looking for a place to eat, and such men are not institutions. They are, more often, nuisances. Van Clief's Epicurean art never left him, but an artist without a studio is handicapped. His reputation became a mere echo among the halls of culinary fame. As the days rolled into weeks, he lost flesh. His clothing, constructed along lines of that graceful contour, flapped dolefully about his wasting frame. His face grew haggard, and his eyes carried an expression of woe. He could find no restaurant to which he had become accustomed. All the money in his Colorado gold mine could not restore him to his institutional pedestal. Sometimes he would see a face that looked familiar, and would place it as belonging to a patron of the old cafe, but when he sought recognition, murmuring his name, the owner of the face would receive him with a blank astonishment which caused Van Clief to reflect bitterly how evanescent is glory. Once he saw on the street one of the waiters of the old Café des Arts. In his loneliness, Van Clief followed the man for hours, in the hope that he might give him a clue to a cafe of worth, only to find that the waiter lived in the suburbs, having retired on his savings. 4. Eventually, the new Café des Arts was completed, and the proprietors, who had laid plans for a big opening, suddenly recalled Van Clief. "We must have the old boy as a guest of honor," said one. "Van Clief, by all means, and we'll fix up his table just as we used to have it," agreed the other. "And Henri can attend him. Aye, and see that Jacques does his very best for the good old fellow." Together they repaired to the Van Clief apartments. The door was opened by a man in funereal black, a gaunt man who held a toothpick in his teeth and eyed them officially. "Where's Mr. Van Clief?" inquired the proprietors of the Café des Arts. "Where's our good old friend?" "That old guy's deader than last year's play," replied the man. "I'm the undertaker. You come a good old friend around here a day too late." He glared at them like an infuriated black bass. "Was the old party a miser?" he inquired. "These rooms are fixed right handsome for a gent who died like he did." "A miser!" the proprietors exclaimed simultaneously. "Why, he was a rich man, a millionaire." "You know what the doctors say he died of?" demanded the undertaker, and they shook their heads like a brace of automatons. "It was starvation," said the fishy man, solemnly. The end. So Damon Runyon... Why do I always say so? Damon Runyon got his start not by writing fiction, like you might expect, but he was a sports writer for a very long time. And in fact, he was such a good sports writer, he's in both the baseball and the boxing Hall of Fames. Baseball Hall of Fame, boxing Hall of Fame is in both of them. And beyond that, his claim to fame is really that he wrote several short stories which inspired the musical Guys and Dolls, although Guys and Dolls is not really a musical that a lot of people do these days, but everybody knows Luck Be a Lady Tonight, so
let's keep the party polite.
In general, Damon Runyon's style is incredibly distinctive. He typically wrote in present tense, which is one of those things that you don't really realize is a thing until you read a story that's in present tense. Usually you would say something like, "The dog ran down the street." But he would write, "The dog runs down the street." And it puts you more into the present moment as opposed to something that's a story that has happened in the past and now someone is relating it to you. It is happening right now in the current moment. He also uses a lot of slang, even in his narrator's voice. A lot of the time people will use slang in dialogue between characters because it makes sense to put it in there, but they'll use very proper English when it comes to like the descriptions and stuff, the narrator voice. But he used a lot of slang even in that narrator voice, and apparently a lot of it came from, you know, the mob and stuff. I don't want to run afoul of the mob just now. Damon Runyon, by all accounts, was friends with several prominent 20s mobsters, and that's part of where both his slang and his voice and some of his plot lines came from, which we also see in Guys and Dolls, which is about, you know, largely about mobsters and their wives or girls or whatever you want to call them. They're dolls, I guess. But almost unfortunately, Hole in the Horn of Plenty was very, very early on in his career, and his distinctive style was not quite yet realized when he published this. It was initially published in Munsey's magazine in 1912, and even though his style wasn't quite there, you can still kind of see his unique perspective and voice shining through. Of course, the story kind of makes light of the idea of being an institution, like Van Cleef's kind of sense of importance that's kind of trumped up by himself and everyone around him. But at the same time, I feel like the core of the story isn't so much the institution of it all, so much as it is kind of fear of change. You can make fun of Van Cleef for being an old guy kind of set in his ways all you want, but at the same time, that kind of shaking things up can still be really scary. Although something tells me that having your cafe burned down around your ears is a little bit more earth-shattering than having your favorite restaurant go away. But there's a little bit of an element of, Goldilocks and the Three Bears there too. This one's too hard, this one's too soft, this one's just right, only he never finds the just right of it all. It's not that these restaurants are not good, it's that he is not used to not being pampered in a very specific set in his ways kind of way, and anything that would be set before him would be found wanting. And of course, for me personally, Van Cleef by itself calls to mind an institution from the past which is no longer as useful or as important as it once was. Oh, and I have to note that this story was a request, so if you have any requests, you can always put them down in the comments, and while you're down there, you might as well subscribe, so that you'll never miss next week's story. See you guys next time.